Hello, I'm Mike Taylor. I work for the Center for Game Science and have been for about the last 2 years. I've read a lot of research around what works for video games and learning, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the research actually shows. So how do we know what works? And I've got both of these in quotation because I believe a little bit their meanings are in the eye of the beholder. I'm going to talk about several ways that we increase our knowingness, and by that, knowing is some level of confidence based on some level of familiarity. It's rarely absolute, and in research we assign a number to our level of confidence, and in everyday conversation we often say that we are 90% sure of things being true. Now, works is in quotations, and it's a synonym for what's effective, but in looking at the research, the effectiveness can be assigned to a lot of different traits. When we say a game works, are we saying that it increases motivation, it increases content knowledge or fluency or self-esteem or social skills, or a host of other behaviors that we as teachers might want to improve? And under what conditions or with what caveats does something work? So to say something works is a fairly broad statement. And in research, we also typically assign a number as to how well something works. And in good research, we really detail the conditions under which it works and suppose when it might work better and when it might not work based on certain conditions changing. So I want to back up a little bit, and before I talk about the research, talk about other things that help us tell if something works or not. And the first of which is common sense. And this is really, to me, the acid test. If it doesn't pass your common sense test as far as probably working in your classroom, well, that intuition is often correct. And the reverse is also true. If your common sense tells you that a game or a particular activity will help promote the learning objectives or the skills that you want to practice in classroom, that also is a pretty good indicator that it will probably work. Doesn't mean that it will, but trusting your own judgment is certainly critical. The next way we often find out about games or activities, and I'm going to stick to games from here on out, is just through anecdotes, very often in the media or from other people telling us that something works. Often there's very transformational stories in the news talking about how classrooms did fantastic using this particular game or software. And so that often feels as if, well, that's a pretty compelling case. And unfortunately, anecdotes are not research, and they're not always truthful. So let the buyer beware. The next part is personal experience. I think this ties a lot with common sense, but it's beyond, it just seems like will work. It's, I've tried it, and in my personal experience, it does work. I've seen the effect in the classroom. I've seen the effect on whatever kind of behaviors I'm trying to address, whether it be motivation or self-esteem or content knowledge or fluency. It addresses those. And so that's a pretty compelling argument. Doesn't mean we can't be wrong, because our own personal experience is often biased by our own filters, but that's a pretty strong argument. And then the last part is research, which is what I'm really going to talk about. And when we talk about research, ideally, this is randomly selected students in a control and an experimental group where the conditions are tightly controlled such that the treatment is the only condition that differs between the control group and the experimental group. So we have what many people would call clinical trials. In addition to this, there usually is a pre-test and a post-test that are hopefully well designed to measure whatever change that we think is going to change. And what these tests measured is tied to our definition of what works. And from these tests, we often get some kind of statistical significance of change, as well as in most of the literature, you will see something called the effect size, which literally is comparing the control group and the experimental group and how much of a standard deviation can you expect it to move. So effect size and statistical significance is usually important because not only it tells us that it does work, but how good is it on a relative scale. And usually 0.4 and above is considered fairly good, and anything below that might be questionable. It doesn't mean it's not valuable, but relative to a lot of other treatments or games or what you want to call them, maybe not as good. And of course, it always goes back to how do you implement them in the classroom, which I'll talk about more. So I'm going to focus on 4 different studies that I've read that come from kind of different people in different venues that just spoke to me. I think they do a pretty good job of bringing in a lot of the big ideas that I've seen in a lot of other studies. The first one is by an author named Haze, which was a paper that was written for the military, looking at gaming and its effectiveness as a training tool. The next one is a book by a man named Meyer, which talked a lot about the different effects of things. It's probably got a lot to do, these first 2, with a primacy effect for myself, and that they're something I read very early on, and they really helped shape my thinking. The SRI report is something sponsored by the Gates Foundation, which is quoted a lot as showing that games are effective, and I'll talk a little bit about what's in it. And the last one is a paper published by the American Psychological Association. Both these last 2 were in a very good article, which was actually a collection of blog posts to begin with, but that was written for KQED, which is an NPR station out of San Francisco. But there's a very good, probably about 40-page article, and a lot of the material they discuss come from this SRI and this APA paper. And all of these claim that games work at some level, and I think most are fairly even-handed at pointing out where there is very good evidence and when it borders on speculation from some promising studies. So first of all, the Haze report. This focused on instructional games. It was for the Air Force. It was a review of 48 studies out of a great number of studies, which you'll often find in many of these what are called meta-studies, is they will look at a lot of other studies, and one of the first things they will say is they looked at, say, 1,000 studies and narrowed it down to 70 in some cases. In this case, it was 48. But he made 5 conclusions, and the conclusions were this. First of all, and I'm going to read them in their entirety, the empirical research on the instructional effectiveness of games is fragmented, filled with ill-defined terms, and plagued with methodological flaws. And so first of all, the research out there is not great. There is some good research, but in general, it's not great. The next one was some games provide effective instruction for some tasks some of the times, but these results may not be generalizable to other games or instructional programs. So some games work. Next is there are no guarantees. Specifically, he said no evidence indicates that games are the preferred instructional method in all situations. So games are not the magic bullet. The fourth one, instructional games are more effective if they are embedded in instructional programs that include debriefing and feedback. And finally, instructional support during play increases the effectiveness of instructional games. And this last one is very interesting. I found a very, what I'd call an outlier in one of the reports that had a very high effect size. It was 1 point, I think. No, it might have been 3. It was very high. But when I actually went back and looked at the original report, it was obvious from reading the instruction that the instructors involved realized the games weren't working and started augmenting the games with instructional support in the classroom. So it's likely one of the reasons the effect size was so high in this particular case was because the teachers were actually injecting instructional support into the actual lesson. In this report, Haze also made 4 recommendations, of which I'm going to list 3 because I didn't think the last one was as relevant. The first one is that the decision to use a game for instruction should be based on detailed analysis of learning requirements and trade-offs among alternate instructional approaches. So you really have to think about how does this game fit into what I'm trying to learn, as well as what am I giving up? When I sacrifice that time in my classroom to do something else like this, what other things could I be doing that might in fact be more effective, or more effective for some students? And it's always a question of what's going to work for which students, because most instructional approaches will not work for every student. And the same is true for games. I've had games which lots of my students have liked, And then I've had a few students just hate them. So you always have to take that into account. The next recommendation was that program managers and procurement officials should insist that instructional games developers demonstrate how their game will support instructional objectives. Because Hayes was really looking at possibly bringing people in to develop games for training. You've got to make sure that they support the instructional objectives. And this is the same to be said if you were just picking them, is you've got to make sure that you are actually doing something in the game that supports your long-term learning objectives. And the next recommendation was that games should be used as adjuncts and aids, not as standalone instruction. This is really important, that Hayes felt that the games themselves were not hugely effective for learning tools, but they were possibly good at augmenting learning and creating a richer learning environment. So I want to read a quote that really kind of ties together these last 2 points. This is from page 40 of his book. The key point is that no instructional game should be conceived as a standalone activity. It should be designed and implemented as a larger instructional program that meets the specific instructional requirements of the task and the learners. As Letterman puts it, the process of debriefing is not ancillary to the educational experience to which it is tied. Debriefing is an integral part of any learning experience that is designed to be experience-based. And there was actually a quote in this quote, which was by Letterman from 1992, page 158. But one of the things I've really come to learn in reading all this is following up with some kind of debriefing, with transferring that learning from the game back to the classroom, is really critical. If you don't do that, essentially the students have just played a game and may not really connect the dots that, oh, this is something related to what we're doing in class. So to kind of summarize, there needs to be a rich discussion around why we did what we did, to really cause the students to capture that learning, to negotiate meaning around what was in the game that was valuable for what's related to the classroom content. And the second one is these games should not be done in isolation. And by isolation, what I mean is they should not be done just on their own. There needs to be this rich support of activities and discussion surrounding it, because very often the games on their own will fall short of the job. The next study I want to look at is the one from the APA, the American Psychological Association, and it talks about the benefits of playing video games. And it puts forth 4 components that they say are likely benefits of playing video games, and they support them with various levels of research. The first one was cognitive. And one of the things that I see over and over again is first-person shooter games actually have a very strong correlation to spatial recognition and spatial training, so to speak. They've been very well studied. So they do have that benefit for that particular task. The article goes on to say that many games, not necessarily first-person shooter games, have the cognitive effect of increasing problem-solving skills as well as creativity. And this is somewhat supported by the research in their article, but it does also kind of meet that common sense test, that because many games are very puzzly, the idea of being able to increase your problem-solving and creativity through trying unique things is not such a stretch, but the research is still a little sketchy here. The next component that they propose is a benefit from playing video games is motivational. And they talk a lot about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and kind of that sweet spot of teaching a student just enough and then giving them a challenge and teaching them a little bit more and giving them a challenge. And this is very motivating because it essentially puts you in a position that you can have success, that you have just enough tools in your toolbox to have success without being overwhelmed by a lot of different options. And this is in fact why gamification seems to be very popular. It's that it gives us that sense of accomplishment, as well as with things like badges. It really meets that desire to collect things, which seems to be an inherently human trait, that we love to collect stickers and such. The next item that is a supposed benefit is emotional benefits. And let me read a quote from page 71. It says, "For example, studies suggest that playing puzzle video games, games with minimal interfaces, short-term commitments, and a high degree of accessibility, such as Angry Birds or Bejeweled 2, can improve players' moods, promote relaxation, and ward off anxiety." So they're proposing here that we can actually affect students' emotional well-being through video games. This section seems the most speculative of the group, and there's not a lot of research here. But the case they put forth does kind of pass that common sense test that, yeah, in the short term, I can see how these kind of successes would, in fact, make people, happy. It's fun, it's enjoyable, and can affect their mood. And finally, the social aspect is another benefit from playing video games. And what was interesting here is they talked about pro-social games lead to short-term pro-social behaviors. And what they mean by that is games with pro-social components, where you have to collaborate with other people, actually lead to collaborative behaviors in real life. And there is research to back this up. One of the more interesting proposals here is it seems like even violent games, first-person shooter types games, potentially have this impact if there's a pro-social component, being there's a cooperative component in these games. Even if the kind of meta content is viewed as maybe somewhat negative, the ability to carry some of these cooperative skills from the video game out into the real world seems to be possible. All right, the next was a book by Richard Mayer called Computer Games for Learning. And he did a very detailed study at looking at a lot of other studies, some of which he conducted and some of which he found in the literature, about things that work and don't work relative to games in the classroom. And most of what he was looking at was actually for learning content. There were a lot of science and math games involved in this reading. So a couple of things that don't seem to really help or hinder in any particular way. Competition doesn't seem to be success or failure. There's a later study I'll talk about that talks about that collaboration and standalone is probably better than competition, but per se, competition doesn't hurt anything. Gender is not an issue as far as success or failure. There are some different behaviors that they often notice between boys and girls and how they play the game and how experimental they are. But as far as actual outcomes, there seems to be very little support that gender plays a bias. Interestingly enough, despite what we know about first-person shooter games, 3D and realism, at least for teaching content, in most cases does not seem to help or hinder. And in fact, there are some studies that show that it might actually detract because of the cognitive load that's required to process these very realistic-looking games. The last two are not actually in Meyer's book, but they fit in the slide here well. Academic level doesn't necessarily play a role, although I have seen some studies that show that those students that traditionally are unsuccessful in the classroom actually are better served by games, but I haven't seen that consistently. And finally, a sound doesn't seem to be a huge component. This is actually a study that Center for Game Science did, and it found that sound made a very little difference when we did an A/B test and published games with and without sound on a fairly large distribution site. Now, the caveat there in our discussion was perhaps a lot of players play with the sound off to begin with, but our point was really if your sound is not critical and if you're a game maker, that may be the last thing that you care about. Anecdotally, I've talked to people who said, they have students who will play through just to, hear a special bell at the end. So take that for what it's worth. So I want to talk a little bit about what Dr. Meyer found out doesn't seem to work. The first one may be a little bit counterintuitive, but words and text at the same time around like explaining things tends to actually be something that doesn't work. And the thinking is this: we tend to read faster than we can hear anyway, and we end up taking in both words and text on two different brain pathways, and it creates confusion for us to try to take these two things in at once. I have looked at some research that said, hey, very text-heavy games might be better off with words and text if your learners are English language learners. And that kind of has a common sense feel to it, but in general, words and text don't work well together. And I just mentioned all of these things here as just kind of a watch out, as when you're looking at games, these are things to consider about whether they'll be effective or not. The next two are about other distractions. One is distracting goals. Are there a lot of other things going on in the game that really don't have anything to do with the content that you're trying to teach? One of the studies we did at Center for Game Science involved kind of a secondary goal we had of collecting jewels as part of our Tree Frog Treasure game, and it's just for fun. It does make the game more fun, but in and of itself, collecting those, especially if they're in odd places, distract the students from attending to the primary goal, which is putting fractions on a number line. So just something to consider when you're looking at games: is most of what's involved there about attending to the goal that you have in mind? And if it's not, is it worthwhile, or can you somehow guide your student to ignore those secondary goals? And finally, kind of related to that, when you're looking at games, are there a lot of distracting game mechanics? And game mechanics are basically how you interact with the game, what some of the rules are. If there are a lot of things that are very complicated in your mind as far as how it works, whether that be the rules or physically interacting with the keyboard or the mouse and such, then that's kind of a red flag of, will this work very well in my classroom? So just some things to think about that's supported by the research. The next item is the SRI Key Learnings. This is a report that the Gates Foundation paid for, and it's pretty widely quoted. The first thing is, in looking at the studies, is they found that games are more effective than non-games, such that you have a control group, an experimental group, where the experimental group is using games. They will almost always be more effective than those that aren't using games. That was one of the findings. The next was that augmented is better than not, and this means teacher supporting the games through activities, through explanation, through making sure that there's adequate debriefing and reflection at the end. And I already kind of mentioned the one outlier I mentioned where it was obvious that the teachers were unintentionally augmenting the game. That led to huge success, although I don't think that was the intention for the initial study to have an augmented game. The augmented game, which was implemented, turned out to be superior. The next thing they found was that more playing equals more learning. There wasn't a kind of sweet spot of, or a exponential kind of growth or anything like that. It was just, in general, more playing was more learning. And one of the things they pointed out is a single game play was not really that much better than a non-game alternative. To get something out of a game, you typically needed to play it more than once. And then the final thing was that collaborative and single player outperformed competitive single play. And I mentioned earlier that competitive doesn't seem to have a real advantage or disadvantage, but collaborative and single player definitely do. And interestingly enough, collaborative and single were about the same. And I'll mention again that collaborative play, especially if you can get the students talking about what's going on, that's where a lot of learning happens. Okay, some practical notes about implementing these in your classroom. The first two I've got question marks on because there's not a lot of research to support either one, and I think the Center for Game Science is actually looking at what's most effective. The first of all is how much introduction to do for a game. And one of the things I remember most from one of the studies I read is, don't be a game splainer. Don't suck all the fun out of the game by standing up there and telling the students how to play it. You're actually ruining part of the effectiveness of the game. However, we know it's good practice to activate prior knowledge. If there are certain things that the students are likely to get stuck on, or things that you really want the students to look for, that seems appropriate. But in general, we all know as teachers we probably talk too much, so err on the side of just letting them play. Now with that, the question is, well, should you ever interrupt them? And this again is your professional judgment. In many ways, if you were watching a movie, you'd probably stop the movie 10 minutes in to kind of refocus attention, to throw out a question that you want the students to think about, and certainly that is likely appropriate. The downside of interruption is, are we ruining that engagement that we're trying to create? If the students are really into what they're doing, do we want to break that rhythm? However, as teachers, we have to ask ourselves, are they focusing on what's important? Do they need a reminder? Do they need a point in the right direction? And certainly, if there's frustration growing in the classroom because of something odd about the game, that's certainly an appropriate time to interrupt, and especially have a student explain what's happening here, how can you fix it, what are some strategies, things like that. So both introductions and interruptions are something where you have to use your professional judgment, because the research doesn't really say if it's helpful or it's hurtful. I think there's arguments for both. Encourage math talk. As I mentioned before, we've done studies that show that if you can get students talking about whatever the subject matter is, we've done it related to math, that is really where the learning happens, and that completely passes kind of the common sense test. The second they start negotiating meanings with their peers, they are creating learning pathways, as well as challenging potentially misconceptions they have and that they have to resolve with their peers. So that's a really important thing, that if you can do that during the game, or certainly after the game, that's really important, which leads to the next point. You've got to debrief. There needs to be some kind of activity that says, what was important about that? Why is it related to the classroom? What other activities do we need to do next to make this meaningful? Exit tickets are always a great idea. And related to that too is, do you need to transfer these skills back to pencil and paper? Very often what they're doing in the game is analogous to what they should be doing in the classroom, but it's not exactly what they're to be doing in the classroom. Dragonbox is a fantastic software for teaching basic algebra principles, and we've done a lot of studies with them. And what we've found, and it's obvious when you look at the game, that the way you solve an equation in the game is not exactly the same way you would do it on pencil and paper, because you can't click on the 0 on your pencil and paper and it magically disappears. You have to write another line without the 0, and that's the analogy. And students can pick this up pretty quick, but they can't do it without some level of guidance. So thinking about transferring skills back to pencil and paper is fairly important. Okay, and I'm going to loop back to common sense, because I think ultimately this is our guide. So some of the reasons that games work. When I was in graduate school for my education master's, one of my professors always talked a lot about puzzlement and the cognitive dissonance that's created in the classroom that really motivates students, and how discovery is a really powerful teaching tool. And this is one of the things that games have the ability to do, is create that sense of puzzlement and motivation and success once we solve that puzzle. Another kind of common sense item that I think is really powerful with games is feedback. Games are always providing feedback. And in many cases now, not only does it provide feedback for the students, there may in fact be like a teacher dashboard which provides feedback to you as the teacher to help you guide further development. So that feedback mechanism, both for the students and possibly for you as a teacher, is really powerful. One of the other common sense items around why games are effective is they're just different. They're not an activity students are used to doing in the classroom. And I would even argue that if you're doing some kind of games all the time or some kind of software all the time, switching it up and not doing that and doing something more physically active has the same kind of excitement as, for most teachers, using games in the classroom has. Different is always exciting. And for most students, using games in the classroom is exciting, as well as we know that games are important to most of our students. So incorporating them is a way to give a nod to, hey, I know this is important to you. I'm trying to make this class relevant to you. And finally, one of the common sense things is I think games do a really good job of meeting 3 of the 8 mathematical practices that are in Common Core. They seem to fit well here. Making sense of problems and persevere in solving them, that's certainly what most games do. And they give you a space to try again, and then analyze our interactions. What worked, what didn't work, did this make sense, did it not make sense, those kind of things. Reason abstractly and quantitatively. I've got the quantitatively in italics there because I don't know if they're great at that, but they certainly help us to think about these kind of things. Why did this work? Why does it work in the larger sense? It really ties to this making sense of problems. And then number 7 on the list is look for and make use of structure. I mean, we are pattern-seeking machines, and games do a really good job of eliciting those patterns, or helping us to figure out patterns, providing patterns that we can then look at and figure out. So those are all, I think, fairly strong common sense arguments for why games work. So hopefully this was useful to you, and thanks for listening.